Queerness is part of London's history, just as it's part of life.
I think something that the queer community struggles with is learning our shared history, because we are a community that also includes so many intersections that create nuances in terms of who may or may not feel historically relevant to certain people. Through researching, I sort of saw that actually there's a sort of wave or things go round in circles. So there was, in the 1970s, a big boom of places, and then that kind of shrunk a little bit, and then in the 80s and 90s it came back, and then we're kind of in the 2000s and 2010s it's shrunk again, and now I think we're in a swing back.
Queerness in London has a history as old as the city itself. Indeed, I would argue that if you look at the generations who form our populations now, the dominant generation politically in this country is those people over 65, whose ideas were shaped by attitudes to life, sexuality, etc., going back to the 19th century.
Now, it was a clash of cultures that led to an unlikely friendship. In 1984, a group of gay and lesbian activists from London arrived in the South Wales valleys to support striking miners.
When you're in a battle against an enemy so much bigger, so much stronger than you, but to find out you had a friend you never knew existed, well, that's the best feeling in the world.
If you look at the bombing at the Admiral Duncan that was in, I want to say 1999, I think the way that the community rallied around that was amazing. And every year you see a vigil there and you see people come together and commemorate what happened there and remember those people who died.
Around the world, there are hundreds of thousands of people still dying of AIDS. So there's a need to reflect not just on the thousands of people who died in London, died around the world, but also on the importance of reflecting upon this is still an ongoing crisis and that we should learn from it.
A mystery disease known as the gay plague has become an epidemic.
We need to learn from the way in which people were demonized, to start off with, the way in which it was described as a gay plague. The Middlesex Hospital in London was the first hospital in the UK to have an AIDS ward. Famously, in 1987, Princess Diana of blessed memory went there and shook the hand of one of the patients at a time when people in this country, and indeed elsewhere, were still thinking that AIDS was somehow contagious. And thereby, she helped to allay some of the fears and demonization that was going on. So in the 1980s and 90s, the AIDS crisis may have been happening, but you also had the development of gayborhoods, you had the emergence of clubs, you had gay coffee shops, gay bars, you had more inclusive spaces emerging, and what's happened in the last 20 years or so is that a plague much more problematic in terms of public spaces has happened, which is a plague called high rental. Most queer businesses do not own the freehold of the land they sit on. A lot of queer housing is not secured.
Queer possibilities would just be like, in a very simple way, like, what? Stop private landlords. Have people have housing that could be beautiful and good for everyone, that has to be both functional and beautiful at the same time. It's possible. It's not that there's not enough homes, it's just that it's being bought up and held empty because it suits the market more. Affordable housing, care for all, like having universal health care that's actually decently funded is something that benefits all people, not just queer people.
Queer people pay taxes the same as straight people and cis people. Queer people have to subsist in public space the same way as other people. Queer people have to navigate the city in the same way as other people. So much public space is designed by and for men. The way in which cities and their transportation systems tend to be designed around male commuting patterns of the 20th century rather than the more diverse and more female inclusive, one would hope, labour markets of the 21st century. So you start thinking about, well, how can we change the way in which these spaces and planning regimes work in order to make them more inclusive and safer and welcoming for people. So one of the things we want to think about is, what are the quick fixes? What are the relatively cheap ways in which you can retrofit these spaces to make them more inclusive? And that can be as simple as putting down a rainbow crossing, which sometimes can feel a bit like rainbow pink washing. But in some spaces, it's really important because it says, no, there are queer people here as well. There was a village down in Gloucestershire a few years ago where they put a rainbow crossing in, and there were letters to the local paper going, we don't have any gay pubs nearer than Bristol, 40 miles away, but we got a rainbow crossing at last. I feel seen in this space.
During the time I've lived here, we've been seeing a rise in hate crimes generally across the board, particularly anti-trans ones. And we've particularly seen it weaponized against, obviously, toilets in ways that reflects like the previous generations of anti-gay, anti-lesbian discourse about queer people, now the trans people being seen as dangerous in these spaces. And I guess one thing I feel like sadly we've learned is like there's no such thing as a truly safe space, there's only safer spaces.
If we take gayborhoods like Soho, that itself may be a safe space, but when you're leaving Soho, when you're leaving a gay bar in Old Compton Street or something like that and heading back into more heteronormative space, then you're at greater risk of being attacked on those liminal spaces between the gayborhood and, if you like, the non-gayborhood. What we want to identify is these are things which are definitely not inclusive. These are ways in which you make a space feel unsafe. So things like hostile design. It's designed to protect property, not people, but we should be prioritising people more and property less.
London is a city that's not very accessible for people who might have access needs. And I think that is an issue with queer spaces in general, an issue with London. You know, everything was built in a basement. Obviously now new spaces have to be wheelchair accessible, but the fact that there are fewer new buildings that are housing these sorts of spaces means that a lot of queer nightlife or organisations are moving into older spaces, for example, older buildings that are not necessarily accessible. Obviously, we had this big loss where nearly 60% of the spaces were closed down or forced to close because of redevelopment. But in the wake of that, we've had this sort of resurgence of queer spaces and a lot of varied queer spaces, whereas before predominantly they were catering towards cis men. I think the closures happened for a number of reasons. Obviously, London has become a very expensive city, and the cost of rents and business rates and licensing and all of that stuff has led people to shutter their venues because they can't afford the upkeep of them. I also think that things like gentrification in areas like East London, for example, where it used to be fairly affordable, now it's just completely outrageously expensive. I also think that the last 25 years, the city has gone through a huge regeneration and redevelopment. So things like Crossrail, I think people don't realise how much the Elizabeth line and the development of the tube stations kind of wiped out huge swathes of spaces, especially in Soho. The transport is good, but there's been a cost for that, and I feel like it has disproportionately affected queer spaces. At times, it can feel a little bit like the city doesn't want people to have fun. It just wants another Pret. I think there needs to be a real systemic change. These communities and these spaces only operate because there are creative people who are willing to put in the time, put in the effort, have the desire to make them. If those people can't afford to live in the city, they'll have to go elsewhere, and you are seeing this. There's the LGBTQ+ Community Centre, which is a fully grassroots organisation. They began just a small group of people, and it's grown, and they did crowdfunding, and now they have a space, and London didn't have a community centre like that since the sort of late 1980s. So it's been good to see the community creating spaces for themselves.
Where do we go from here? Particularly in London, where obviously a lot of space is already designed and established. So how do you retrofit a lot of that space? You need to communicate with all of these communities to make sure that you're reflecting their needs. We need to bear in mind that the queer population is ageing. So there is going to be a need for more sheltered housing, more elderly mentally infirm housing for queer people. People who have been out of the closet for all their lives are at the moment having to go back into the closet when they get to a certain age. That is unacceptable.
I think London is worth fighting for. There's so much history here. There is still community here if you can find it. It is an amazing place to be. I do think that this country puts too much emphasis on it, and it would be good to see a decentralisation. And I think a decentralisation would actually help the city regain some of its personality. People will always find a way, and I think there is this pattern of LGBTQ+ people being like, no, we'll just do it for ourselves, which I don't necessarily think you see amongst heterosexuals necessarily, where they think we're going to do this thing for us because everything caters to that.
We need to encourage people to go out there and think about, how do you make spaces more fun? How do you make them more inclusive? How can you, from a playbook of ideas, create a sense in which these spaces are variegated, are signalling diversity and inclusivity and utilizing people so that everyone feels welcome within them? Because in the end, that's what we should be about.